The next macros I have in here are my talkbacks. And what I tend to do is I actually set my solo bus up off the matrix, which I can show you here. So the solo bus, I route into the matrix, and then from the matrix, that then routes out and goes to my in-ear transmitter. And then I have a mono group labeled talks. And the advantage with this is I can then have a macro, which if I fire the macro, you should be able to see what it does if I find some inputs. So my talkback mics are on my left-hand bank. There you go. And what I have is I have two macros. So basically, put it up here so you can see. So for the sound check, the talkbacks are routed to the master bus, which is the main artist, and they will also be sending on the auxiliaries to every musician in the band. When I go to show mode, so if I fire the macro for show, what happens here is it unroutes it from the master bus, and on the auxiliaries, it turns the sends off. The idea being then during the show, musicians can speak to me, they can speak to their techs, but anything they say won't be heard by the rest of the band or by the main artist. And consequently, in sound checks, everybody can hear what everyone is saying. And the advantage there is obviously in sound checks and rehearsals, people want to hear what they're saying. During the show, if a keyboard player is talking to his tech or talking to me, he doesn't want the rest of the band necessarily to hear what he's saying and to distract them. So with this one simple macro, I can change the routing to make sure that only the people who need to hear what's being said can hear what's being said. Other macros you can use is I've got one here for muting all my speakers on stage and one for opening up the speakers. And the other thing you can do with this is actually, if you set them onto the same button, you can see it here, it actually changes color when I fire it. So for when it's live speakers, which is during show mode, the macro goes green. And when I mute the speakers, it goes red. The reason I have that macro is pre-show, I will have all the in-ears on and all the inputs open, but all the speakers muted, obviously, so the audience don't hear it. And then the downbeat of the first song, I can turn on the side fills and any other wedges on stage. So once you come through the gain, you then hit your high and low pass filters. Now, this is one of the biggest tools in terms of shaping the sound. If we go to the keyboard inputs on this song, and if I just solo up, say, the Leslie high, so you can hear the Leslie here. Now, that's with the high pass filter out, and you can hear a bit of low end rumbling there, depending on what you're listening to. And if I put the high pass filter in, that cleans up a lot of the low end. Now, I've currently got that set at 360 hertz. If you listen to the Leslie low microphone, the opposite's true there, where if I take the low pass filter out, I can hear too much of the top. So if I punch the low pass filter in, that cleans up the bottom end. And then when I sum the two together, it sounds like a Leslie cabinet. So that's quite a good example of how to use your high and low pass filters to clean up your mix. It's really important when you're building the mix that you get rid of unwanted noise from inputs. You don't want to be too extreme. Overheads are a good example. You might, depending on the type of music you're doing, you might get rid of all the low end out of your overheads and make it just so it's just the cymbals, and then you can place that on top of your kick, your snare, and your hat. And that works really well if you're after a sort of rocky sound. If you're after a more jazzy sound, you might actually leave the overheads more full range, and then that's the basis of your drum mix, and then you just add in a bit of kick, snare, and hat to supplement. So it depends from which angle of attack you're approaching it. But the high and low pass filters are crucial to get rid of the unwanted noise, particularly the lows and the highs. Obviously, that's what they do. But that really helps you when you're touring and when you're going from venue to venue, because one of the biggest challenges, particularly with in-ear monitoring nowadays, is you have multiple mixes and snapshots set up for a show, but then you're moving to different acoustic environments every day. And if you can filter out the unwanted noise, that also gets rid of a lot of the nasty room noise that can spill into the microphones. And that way, when you go from one venue to the next, your mix isn't changing radically. The musicians have consistency, everyone knows where they stand, and it makes for a successful tour. So high and low pass filters, absolutely crucial. Once you've then got your sounds EQ'd, and to be fair, I mean, you can see, if I show you on this screen here, I'm not a huge fan of EQ. I think you can see that, I mean, a little bit on the kick drum, you know, again, high and low pass filters on most things, the odd little dips here and there. I think it's really important to try and allow the musicians to hear what they're playing and the actual tone of their instruments. They spend a long time getting the tone they want. What we're just doing, I think, is just shaping that sound to make it work in their own ears. I don't think it's necessarily my job as a monitor engineer to reinvent the wheel and make it sound completely different. Obviously, with pop music, sometimes you have to do that. That's part of the job. But more often than not, if there's a problem with the sound, it's best to go back to the source. If the guitar doesn't sound right, maybe change the microphone. Maybe the guitar player needs to change the cab for that song. It's a process where you work together and you try and get the sound that the artist and the musician wants. But ultimately, if they've already chosen that guitar combo with that guitar pedal, with that guitar, then that's the sound they want you to recreate. So again, really useful tip is go on stage, take your in-ears out, listen to the guitar cab, and then go back and use your EQ to make it sound as close as possible to how it sounds without the in-ears. And that's something that not too many people do, but I think it's a really worthwhile tip to go on stage and actually walk around the stage and talk to the musicians and listen to the instrumentation and try and recreate that for them in their in-ears, because ultimately that's what you're doing. You're a monitor engineer. They want to monitor what they're playing.
Our last option here is quite interesting. This is control group faders control aux send. Now the little message that comes up on here is when aux sends assigned to faders, control groups trim sends. I don't know about you guys, but I kind of had to break that down a little bit to fully understand what it does in order to kind of tell you. I know what it does and I use it all the time, but being able to actually communicate that I found quite difficult. So here is my attempt, and I'll try and give you a demonstration at the same time. Okay, so if we enable this option here, I can then go ahead and pick up my auxes. I want to assign my aux sends to faders. So at the moment, to do that, I'm going to PFL this mix. Then, if I leave this mix in PFL and go back through to my control groups, pick up the control groups, and here they are. Now, at the moment, you can see all of the faders have snapped to the middle. So at the moment, what that means is they have now become plus or minus 18 dB trims for any of the channels that are housed within those control groups within that mix. The easiest way I found to think of this is using them to mix within an aux send. So for a quick example, the person I'm sending this mix to tells me that they want a bit less drums overall. Instead of having to go through and individually take down drum channels from the inputs, I can just use the drum control group and bring that down. So yeah, this is something I do still use and I find it really helpful. Solo displays all aux sends. So what this means is when I go ahead and activate this, if I then solo a channel, it will bring up all of the auxes that this channel is actually being sent to. So here we can see all of the aux sends that this channel is being sent to individually. This is definitely a really useful option, especially if you've got everybody asking for the same thing. This can be really useful for making a change across all mixes really quickly. I might find sometimes that a talkback channel can be too loud for certain people and they'll all say the same thing at the same time. Can we have less of so and so? So rather than me having to pick up each individual mix and take it out, if I have this enabled, I can quite easily go across and turn it down in everybody's mix. The next two, again, I'm going to do in conjunction with each other. We have solo assigns aux to faders and solo assigns aux to rotaries. What this means is when you solo an aux, the aux sends will be assigned to either the channel faders or the channel rotaries for you to make the mix with. I am very much a fan of the aux to faders, so I will use that at any given opportunity. In addition to having this activated all the time, I use this in conjunction with a macro that actually brings up the aux send to faders options too. So I then have two different ways to access my mixes. I do find that really useful to have both in case I'm working with a smaller console or in case my screen's getting a bit cluttered. With the rotaries option, instead of assigning the aux sends to the faders, it actually assigns them to these under-screen rotaries here. Next up, we have solo reverts to output. So what that means is, bear with me, if you have an output soloed that you're listening to, let's say, and you go ahead and you solo an input afterwards, if you then take that input solo off, it will automatically revert back to the output that you'd already soloed. Normally, without that on, after you'd cancel the solo of the input, nothing would be soloed anymore. However, with this in place, it means that once you turn that input solo off, you're automatically back in your soloed output mix. Now, I find this super useful for creating mixes because 9 times out of 10, I will go in to a mix, solo the mix itself, and then solo some of the inputs. And if I don't have this on, I'm going to be brought straight back to square one and I'll have to go and do it all again. So this is a really, really useful tool that I find really helpful.
This is how I set up my matrix mixer. I have 2 solo buses on the Q7. I set solo 1 as a mono bus for my Q wedge and solo 2 as a stereo bus for my IEMQ. I send my stereo bus to 2 matrix inputs and assign the outputs of the matrix to 2 physical outputs on the SD rack. I can now mix inputs like talkbacks into my solo bus. I send my IEM mixes to the aux outputs and are patched to the SD rack. I also create a spare path by bringing the IEM left and right into two inputs of the matrix mixer. They are patched to two different matrix outputs going to the spare IEM transmitter. I believe when creating a spare, you should change the entire path. I have created a macro that switches input paths to the spare IEM mix. And here it is. I have also set up a macro that allows me to send any one of my mixes to the spare. And here it is. I run two channels of pink noise to check the speakers and the IEMs. The first channel is sent to the speakers and the left-hand side of the IEMs. The second channel is sent to the right-hand side of the IEMs. I then hard pan all my stereo auxes that are sourced from the pink noise channels. Then I use my aux out masters to control the level going to the speakers. On the IEMs, I use the receiver to control the volume of the pink noise and the channel mutes to verify left and right.